We're going to start just a couple of minutes late because we got people backed up at the gate. You guys probably all had to navigate that. It's good, a good problem that we got some more people coming in, but we're going to give them a couple minutes.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you guys for coming. It sounded like we have a little bit of a backup at the gate, so we just wanted to give everyone a few minutes to get settled in. So if you see people coming in, don't get distracted by them. Well, thank you guys so much for being here. How many people, this is their first time here at Harbor Branch? Wow, that's quite a bit of you. Well, welcome. And for those who didn't raise your hand, welcome back. We really appreciate you guys being here. Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute was founded in 1971, and we are now the northernmost campus of Florida Atlantic University. So we recently celebrated 50 years of ocean science for a better world. I'm the Outreach Project Coordinator. My name is Laura. It's my job to share science with the community. And aquaculture holds a special place in my heart because when I was doing my graduate studies, I worked in the aquaculture department here at Harbor Branch. So I'm particularly excited to share this workshop with you today. So what is aquaculture? If you haven't been here before, then this definition's for you. It is the farming of aquatic plants and animals for food, research, and stock enhancement. Today, we're going to be talking about aquaculture for food and research, but next month, if you come back to see us, we'll be talking about aquaculture for the use of stock enhancement or restoration. Here at FAU Harbor Branch, we have spent decades developing techniques and technologies that will further advance aquaculture, and we have hosted workshops to educate the industry professionals in the past. But last year, Dr. Gabby Barbarite, the Director of Outreach and Engagement, partnered with faculty here, and they wrote a grant to host public workshops to educate the community on the seafood industry, the important role of aquaculture, and answer some of the most common questions that we get. So we're standing here now because that was granted through the Aquaculture Specialty License Plate that is through the Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute Foundation. So thank you very much to the foundation. If you're local here in Florida, please buy a plate. The proceeds go back to research and education. So this is the third of a 4-part series. They're hosted the second Saturday of each month, and they focus on a different topic. So far, we've had an introduction to aquaculture and sustainable seafood, and we had talks on general Florida aquaculture, the sustainable seafood industry, why seafood's good for your health, etc. And last month, we took a deeper dive into fish aquaculture here in Florida. If you missed either of our past 2 workshops, no problem. They were recorded and put online. That website is on the flyer that is out on the front table. So definitely grab one of those if you want to watch the past workshops. So today, it's all about invertebrate aquaculture focused on shrimp, clams, and oysters. We have an excellent lineup. We have scientists, a filmmaker, and local farmers. So please get excited for that. Just a few housekeeping notes before I step down. I'll be the MC. I'm going to introduce each presentation. I'm going to try and keep us all on time, which I've already gotten us a little bit backed up, but we'll jump back on time. The schedule, I tried to hand one to every one of you, but if you didn't grab one, there are some outside on the table where you walked in. Please grab one if you need. We'll have our five speakers, we'll have a video, and then we'll have a panel discussion, which is what this table is here. We encourage you to take notes, take photos, and just know that this session will be recorded and posted online later, so you'll always have that recording to go back and reference. And we'll also email you the link to that when it's ready. Please silence your cell phones. Take notes on any questions that you have so that you can ask them to our presenters at the end of the morning. And enjoy. Let's get started. Okay, I'm actually going to introduce the first talk. So the first talk is going to be by Dr. Jim Masterson. He's an assistant research professor here at FAU Harbor Branch, and he's going to be talking about an introduction to shellfish aquaculture.
Thanks so much for coming out today, and for those of you that this is the first workshop you've attended, do know that you can go back and see the first 2 that are online. So let me see. There we go. Last month it was all about finfish, and today it's the crustaceans that we're going to be talking about and the mollusks that we're going to be talking about. So there are more than 30 invertebrate phyla in the marine world. So invertebrate aquaculture really focuses on 2 little slivers of 2 of them, a portion of the mollusks and a portion of the arthropods. Looking at the global picture, the mollusks is primarily bivalves. We're going to talk about one gastropod as well. And then we've got marine crustaceans, and those are the Penaeid shrimps. And then the freshwater crustaceans are the giant river prawns. And all of that together is just about 16% or so of the international story. Freshwater fishes make up the bulk of global aquaculture production, and that little blue sliver is marine finfish, and that's a small but growing and essential part of global aquaculture that we talked about a lot last session. Compared with finfish, we have lesser abundances and fewer species of crustaceans and mollusks being grown. If we look at our invertebrates comparing capture to aquaculture, aquaculture is doing a really good job. We are farming more mollusks, more saltwater crustaceans, more freshwater crustaceans than we are pulling out of the wild. So that's one of the big things aquaculture can do for us, is to alleviate fishing pressure. Looking at this very busy global story for the top 10 species groups, we see 3 of these groups, the ones we just talked about, the shrimp and prawns, and then the oysters, clams, cockles, arc shells. That's 3 of the top 10 global species in terms of production, and that production, again, just shy of 16% of the totals in 2021. If we look at the United States, 2 of the top 4 categories are, again, mollusks and crustaceans, and so they're a big part of the U.S. aquaculture picture as well. About $525 million. 2018 was the latest information I'm able to access there. So turning our attention to bivalves and using information from the FAO SOFIA document. This is the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. It's the best place to get comprehensive global aquaculture information. We've got 8 bivalve species groups that are the top contributors to production, and so we've got 2 types of oysters in that group, 3 different clams or cockles, 1 family of scallops, the pectinids, and then 2 types of middled mussels. And together, that makes up 84% of all of the invertebrates being grown around the world. Then there's lots and lots of things that are in the other category, dozens and dozens of things that make up another 16% of that. And together, that 17.7 million metric tons, that is only 36% of what that inland freshwater production is, but it is nearly 3 times more than the marine and coastal finfish production. So we'll use those as benchmarks. We talked about Seafood Watch in the first session, had somebody from Seafood Watch give a wonderful presentation. That's the brochure you can look at to see if you're making informed choices as far as sustainable seafood. We have a best choice here with all of our bivalves. They are a net benefit to the environment, and you're going to hear a lot about that today. Across the board, pretty much you're making a good choice when you are choosing bivalves. So clams, cockles, oysters, these are the leading farmed bivalves. And when this graph was put together back in 2015, the clams and cockles had just edged out the oysters. That's flip-flopped just a little bit in the last couple of years, but they're the big contributors. Mussels and scallops, still a significant contribution to global totals. Interesting thing about bivalves, less than 5% of the global production actually gets into international markets, and that's among the lowest in all of the seafood trade. It's due to the perishability of this product, potential human health hazard if they're not handled properly, and that's reflected in the dominance of local live fresh products like half-shell oysters, shucked meats, etc. So, for example, of the 6 million metric tons, that's what MMT stands for, of global oyster production in 2018, less than 1% of that actually made it to the international market. So turning specifically to oysters, they're farmed around the world, and only 5% of oysters that we consume are actually coming from wild harvest. 95% is now aquaculture. Aquaculture production increased almost 6-fold in a 30-year span, from 1.2 million metric tons in 1990 to more than 6 million metric tons now, value of almost $7.5 billion. And China, they're giants in aquaculture, as you've learned if you've been here the last 2 workshops. They're 85% of that global total. They consume almost all of that production, and very little of that leaves China. So that's the international picture, with China making that huge contribution. They're the only ones that are measuring their annual production in millions of metric tons. The U.S., we only produce about 3% of what China produces, but we still come in fourth. So that, again, shows the dominance of China. There's about a dozen different species grown around the world, and there is a good bit of non-native production. We grow Pacific cupped oysters in the U.S., for example. That was an intentional introduction back in the 1930s. The production methods for oysters look very similar to all the bivalves we're going to talk about today. Starts with spat that can be collected from the wild. That was the traditional way of obtaining seed. But you can also produce it in the hatchery. And hatchery-produced seed, they're going to spend a period of time in a land-based or field-based nursery, usually both. Then they get moved out into the field, and they continue to be grown in field-based trays, and then there's a lot of different on-bottom or off-bottom growing techniques that you see. Why do they go out into the field? Well, that green water there is food. That's good eating for bivalves. On land, you've got to grow all that microalgae. And we do a good job growing microalgae in the industry, but it is labor intensive, there's expertise involved, and it's very expensive. You wouldn't make any money if you fed these things for the whole life. So you put them out in nature, you let nature pay for the groceries. All right, Japanese carpet shells. These are manila clams, and this is actually a huge part of global bivalve aquaculture. We typically only see them when we go to Chinese buffets. You see them in that garlic sauce. You can find them in stores, but it actually is 24% of global bivalve aquaculture. Oops, what's going on there? Let me go back to where I was. Wow. Okay. There I am. These guys are a subtropical to warm temperate Pacific clam. There's populations natively in a lot of that area. They've also been introduced in a lot of parts of the world, including the Pacific coast of North America. There is a non-native fishery as well as an aquaculture industry for them there. So now manila clams are farmed on 3 continents, vast majority still coming from China. And about 86% of all clams that were grown in 2020 was manila clams grown in China. So a big part of the global story. Italy and South Korea make contributions, but nowhere near what China is producing. And this story here, similar to so many aquaculture species, slow and steady from about the mid-1980s with consistent high production for the last decade or two. Production methods, similar to what we see for oysters. You can have hatchery-produced or wild seed. If you're getting wild seed, then you will forego that land-based nursery. Using bottom culture most often with a protective mesh covering to keep predators from eating your stocks. And then typically mechanical harvesters are used when those guys are harvested anywhere from 12 to 30 months after planting out. Lots of other clams around the world that are cultured. And that includes, for the adventurous among us, the gooey ducks that you can find on the west coast of the United States, and our own hard clams, our quahogs that you're going to hear a lot about today. Mussels, they are both temperate and tropical. You can find shallow coastal environmental culture. You can find deeper offshore culture as well. Global production, just over 2 million metric tons in 2018. China produced about half of that. Chile and Spain are important producers as well. We can use, again, on-bottom or off-bottom culture for these guys. Once these guys are in the field, and sometimes they spend their whole life in the field there's no additional feed provided, there's no medicines or chemicals used, and they are just feeding off of wild productivity. Still a lot of reliance on wild mussel seed And 10% of the mussel production actually enters the international trade, so that's higher than the 5% that we talked about for other stocks. Again, you see China's dominance there. Chile and Spain together, they're about 72% of what China is producing, so that's pretty good. We've got more than 3 dozen mussel farms in the U.S., but we're not in that group of top producing countries. We produce mussels on both coasts, in Washington State and California out west, in Maine and Rhode Island primarily here. Just like oysters, lots of different mussels that are grown, and there are instances of non-native mussel culture as well. Similarities in farming techniques here. The wild spat that is collected gets socked. It gets placed in these mussel socks. These days there's a rope in the middle of that sock, and the mussels attach with their byssal threads, the protein threads, onto that rope. The sock will dissolve over time, and you end up with this line of beautiful mussels that you harvest. Variety, again, of on-bottom, off-bottom growing techniques around the world. Scallops, they're not as widely cultured as clams or oysters. They're neck and neck with mussels, but it's been a steady growth of the industry since the 1970s, and there's only about 25% of scallops that are being wild harvested now. So aquaculture, again, doing its part to meet that demand without impacting wild populations. Same story as the other bivalves, lots of different scallops being grown around the world. A lot of the industry does rely on non-native species, U.S. imported bay scallops, Japanese imported yeso scallops as a good example there. And in the United States, Maine and Massachusetts are the primary farmers of our mussels. Scallops, there's China again dominating the story with over 90% of all of the scallops that are produced. Japan, Peru come in second and third, but their numbers are nowhere near China's. Lots of different cultivation techniques. Reliance on wild spat is still pretty widespread. Where you're growing non-natives, you can't rely on wild spat, and that's where you're using your hatchery-reared spat and a variety of on-bottom and off-bottom culture techniques, including those traditional lantern baskets that I really like. Leaving bivalves, and before we go to crustaceans, I'm going to talk about abalone. It is a mollusk, but it's a gastropod. It's an ancestral cousin to our snails, and I actually enjoyed a wonderful abalone appetizer up in Gainesville just a couple of days ago. I rarely get a chance to have abalone. These guys were first farmed back in the 1950s in Japan. First large-scale hatcheries were launched in the mid-1960s. And now China, South Korea, South Africa, Chile, and Australia are the top producers. We have an abalone industry as well on the U.S. West Coast. Primarily, it's the green abalone. These are the ones I had this week. They have a native range, basically Southern California down through Baja, Mexico. Lots of species are grown all around the world. There's a variety of systems that are used. There's culture phases similar to what we see for the bivalves, but these guys, after settlement, they don't continue to consume microalgae. They start eating mat-forming diatoms and then ultimately macroalgae, kelp and other things. They're still herbivores for their entire lives. And you can see there are some big operations. That's a large-scale farm in South Africa. So these guys in the wild take 8 to 10 years to develop and get to a minimum legal harvest size. We can do it in 2 to 3 years in captivity, and now more than 95% of what we consume is coming from aquaculture, protecting those wild stocks. Even 2 to 3 years, that's a long time for a cultivated product. We want to get something to market as quick as we can. Why spend 2 to 3 years on something like this? Well, it's a high-value product. Shell on, this often sells for $25 a pound, and as clean steaks, this is often over $100 a pound. So this is a very high-value product. We're moving on to crustaceans now, and back to the SOFIA numbers, we see the 8 species groups as the top contributors to global crustacean culture. That includes 2 Penaeid shrimp, Pacific white shrimp and tiger shrimp. 1 crayfish, that is our own red swamp crawfish, although we don't do most of the growing. 3 crabs, all international, and 2 of the giant river prawns. And together, that comprises more than 95% of the total. The other category here is less than 5% of the total. And that 11.2 million metric tons, that is 1.7 times higher than marine and coastal finfish production, but it's less than a quarter of the inland fish production. Penaeid shrimp, they've been grown for more than a long time, more than a century actually, but 2 species dominate. And Penaeidae, that's the family that these belong to. So the Pacific white shrimp, or the white-leg prawn, and the tiger prawn, these are the ones that dominate the market. Lots of other species have been grown, but because of the superior traits, these have risen to the top. Modern shrimp farming we can trace to the 1960s. By the 1990s, it was a significant industry that's continued to grow. Traditionally, shrimp are grown in these coastal ponds. This is in the Sundarbans. Traditional culture involved trapping wild post larvae that have come inshore from the offshore spawning grounds. And here's some folks that are using fine mesh nets to collect those post larvae to stock into those traditional ponds. Breeding techniques that began in the 70s now allow hatcheries to supply post larvae to the industry. Tiger shrimp industry is still doing a lot of that wild post larval collection. So in 2018, over 40 countries were producing Penaeids. The industry is an important source of employment around the world. Asia, far and away the biggest contributor with over 80% of the production. But interestingly, China doesn't dominate. It's a all-hands affair with lots of Asian countries that are leading to that, lending to that production. Latin America is significant with close to 20% of the farm totals. Global shrimp farming worth over $36 billion in 2018. This is a high-value product. The quality, the health status of the post larvae is really important. That was a hard lesson to learn, and the industry took a lot of lumps in the late 80s through the 90s, learning lessons with global viral outbreaks that almost put the industry under in a lot of parts of the world. So now we use specific pathogen-free, specific pathogen-resistant post larvae that can be available all around the world, that the farms can use and feel confident about the health of those stocks. Looking at white shrimp, they're actually native to the eastern Pacific, but they now dominate warm water shrimp aquaculture, and they're grown in lots of other parts of the world. It's over 3/4 of the annual farm production. 2018, almost 5 million metric tons of production. And now that there is this wide availability of healthy hatchery-reared post larvae, we see expansion across the globe. China, big producers here, but there's several other countries making significant contributions. Together, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia are snapping at China's heels with almost 90% of that production. Annual production exceeded 2 million metric tons in 2006. It topped 4 million metric tons a decade later. Shrimp farms, we characterize them by their intensity level, how much shrimp we're pulling out of a unit area. And we talked about that in the last couple of workshops. Traditionally, these ponds were extensive, low input, low output. And now the trend worldwide is for higher intensity, more stocking, more generous feeding, a lot of attention to detail so they don't all go belly up or succumb to disease. Generally, the white shrimp is a more intensive operation in Southeast Asia compared to in Latin America. Here's the production schematic for Pacific white shrimp. This larval phase here, it's actually pretty complex. There's 5 or 6 Nauplier stages. That's a non-feeding stage, and those transition into a zoeal stage where they start to feed on microalgae. Then the mysis stage where they're feeding on microalgae, and in the wild they'd be feeding on zooplankton. In the hatchery, we have to provide the zooplankton for them to eat, and that's primarily newly hatched Artemia. Post-larvae, these guys are omnivores. They become very efficient zooplanktivores at this stage. The extensive ponds, where you're not putting a whole lot of stock or input into it, you may just fertilize that pond and not actually provide any kind of supplementation. Semi-intensive, intensive ponds, you may be giving all of that in the form of prepared pelletized feeds. So that's one aspect of intensification. That got cut off there, and I'm not sure what's going on there. Sorry about that. Tiger shrimp. They're native to Australia, Southeast Asia, East Africa. Again, still heavily reliant on wild seed, and so that confines the industry. It's not as globally spread out as we see for the white shrimp. So in 2018, only about 15% of the global shrimp totals were tiger shrimp. Some of that, the pendulum's starting to swing back because people miss tiger shrimp in the market. So they have chewed back some of that percentage in recent years. Here we see Vietnam and Indonesia leading production, and that's where tiger shrimp are found native. Recent annual production has remained very steady. Very similar growth history here, but again, a lot of reliance on wild post-larvae as well as some hatchery-reared inputs. In an extensive situation, you're stocking maybe 1 to 5 post-larvae per square meter of pond, and you're only getting about 0.3 to 0.5 metric tons per hectare out of that pond. As we move into improved extensive ponds, we're getting 0.5 to 0.7 metric tons per hectare. When we move further into the semi-intensive and intensive categories, we are now getting from 1 metric ton to 8 metric tons or more out of the system, but there's more effort, there's more input. Crawfish, crayfish/crawfish, best known as a regional delicacy here in the United States, but China is now consuming 90% of the crawfish being eaten around the world, and it's a relatively new thing. In the early 90s, China wasn't eating a lot of crawfish, but by 2016, that had exploded to 870,000 metric tons, and now almost all of the crawfish produced is coming from China, almost 97%. In contrast, we produce about less than 4% of what China produces. What's going on here? Okay. Let me get back here. So that species that is being produced, that is our red swamp crayfish that is being grown in China. So typically this is a rotational crop polyculture system grown along with rice. More modern monoculture systems have been developed as well. There is a small growing Australian industry, and it's a different species entirely that's being grown there. We have crab aquaculture globally. We don't do crab aquaculture in the United States outside of some shedding facilities where blue crabs can be wild harvested and then maintained until they shed, and then you have a high-value product to sell. But we are not egg to entree producing crabs the way other parts of the world are. Chinese mitten crabs, this is a big industry, and it is mostly China and South Korea producing these guys, just shy of 800,000 metric tons produced in 2020. This actually was an invasive threat in Chesapeake Bay, and fortunately it doesn't look like they've taken hold, but there was a lot of concern when they showed up in Chesapeake. And then 2 species of Scylla mud crabs are also cultivated as well. A little more than 400,000 metric tons produced in 2020. Looking at wild harvest versus aquaculture, wild harvest is still a big part of the story, and it's different countries that are wild harvesting versus producing. You see the Philippines leading the pack there in production. Finishing out my part of the morning with freshwater prawn aquaculture. These are big internationally. You don't see a whole lot of macrobrachium prawns in our markets these days, but 522 plus thousand metric tons in 2020. China, Bangladesh, Thailand, India, Taiwan now lead production. Similar life history, similar production methods that we've seen. Up here you see the buried females carrying their eggs. They go through a multi-stage larval phase. We're feeding them artemia. The prawns are put in ponds, and then you end up with that beautiful product there. And that ends my portion of the morning. You can't go to lunch just yet, but hopefully we've set the stage, and you guys are hungry for the rest of the morning. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Jim. He always puts so much information into his overview talk, but it's always so enjoyable to learn about all the different aspects of aquaculture. So our next presentation is going to be given by Dr. Susan Larimore. She's also a associate research professor here at FAU Harbor Branch. She's going to be talking about invertebrate aquaculture research at FAU Harbor Branch, and this presentation will explore the wide variety of invertebrate research conducted here, including research projects conducted with shrimp, oysters, clams, sea urchins, and sea cucumbers. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Larimore.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for spending your Saturday morning with us. So, as Laura said, Jim introduced the aquaculture industry to you as far as invertebrates, and I'm going to talk about the research that has been conducted. In probably the past 15 years, I've been here for a little bit over 20 years, and I've been a PI for about 15. And so I'm just going to share some snippets with you. I'm going to hope that it cooperates.
Good luck.
Good luck. Oh, that's not going to work. Okay. I'll use the mouse. All right. So we've worked with a wide variety of invertebrates here at Harbor Branch over the years. I'll have to admit most of my work has been with crustaceans and bivalves, but we've done a little bit with echinoderms and also with the gastropods. When I tried to put this talk together, I had to think about the types of research that we have done here. And we've done a wide variety of research with invertebrates. So I categorized it into 5 major categories that we'll be talking about. And I'll just give you a little snippet of the research that has been done in each of those categories. We'll leave a lot of it out because, as I said, when I got to looking at this, we've done a lot more than, when you start thinking, okay, well, we did that project, and we did that project, and we did that project. We're going to start with dietary studies. I've probably done more dietary studies than any type of studies, and probably work with the widest variety of organisms doing dietary studies. So why would we even want to focus on dietary studies in an aquaculture setting? Well, obviously, we have to feed them. And finding an optimal diet for them that increases their growth is important. But another thing to point out as Jim mentioned, was that feed is costly. Feed, labor, and then followed by electricity are probably the three most costly inputs in any aquaculture facility. In the past dozen years or so, there has been a push to replace at least a portion of the fish meal and pelleted diets with an alternative source. Typically that's a plant source, but some people have looked at insect meal, yeast from breweries, even microalgae, different types of things. At Harbor Branch, and you probably heard about this last week, we have something called an integrated multi-trophic aquaculture system. I'm sure Paul Wills mentioned it. And there's a picture up here of the guts of the thing. You can see a shrimp tank here. It's biofloc culture, biofloc reactor. Those things I'm going to talk about a little bit later, so I'm pointing them out. And then basically the central reservoir and tank systems for that particular system. It's an environmentally friendly way to culture a multitude of species. It uses very little water, and it is very efficient as far as waste generation because you use those waste products as a food source for other species within that culture system. And it typically, we have fish and shrimp as our fed species. Then we may work with echinoderms and bivalves, and also with ulva as our biofilter. And so biofloc is a byproduct of that land-based IMTA system, and we're going to talk about that in this presentation. This is a picture of what biofloc would look like microscopically. It's an aggregate of microorganisms, bacteria, zooplankton, and phytoplankton. And it can be used as a food source. It's high in protein, moderate in the amounts of fat. Seaweed is another product that we produce from our IMTA system. It's used as our biofilter, and it can also be used as a food source. It's also high in protein, minerals, and vitamins, and it is low in fat. In addition to working with pelleted feed diets, we work with microalgae. As Jim mentioned, bivalves consume microalgae their entire lives. That is their food source. But also, small animals, whether it's fish or crustaceans, also consume microalgae at some point in time early in their life stages. And so we've looked at the benefits or how different types of microalgae affect growth and reproduction. And also we've taken a look at alternatives to live microalgae. Why would we want to use those? Well, some facilities, because of the labor costs, don't have the staff to fully produce microalgae. As has already been mentioned, that's a full-time job, and it is labor intensive. In a big aquaculture organization, particularly a bivalve culture industry, would have somebody that was their entire full-time job, was just culturing microalgae. There's off-the-shelf convenience for maybe smaller facilities, and you could also perhaps use it as a backup to microalgae if you preferred to use live microalgae like we do here. Here in Florida, we get a lot of tropical storms. We lose power. So what happens when that occurs and your microalgae crashes because we don't have power, but you still have to feed your animals? This is just a summary of some of the types of dietary experiments that we have done. Again, looking to replace fish meal with other types of meal, the biofloc and the ulva that I've already mentioned from our IMTA system, using fresh seaweed in place of a commercial diet or to supplement a commercial diet. We've conducted some dietary preference studies. And as I mentioned, working with live microalgae diets and microalgae concentrates. For that, it's been exclusively bivalves. So as I said, I'm going to walk you through just a couple of results from experiments that we have conducted over the years. This is an experiment where we used dried ova as a replacement diet for fish meal. We used 4 different treatment levels, one where it was completely fish meal, all the way up to a 60% replacement with ova. And this was done in 80-liter tanks here on campus. This is survival. We saw no difference in survival, but you can definitely see a difference in growth. This is the control diet, and the higher the amount of ova that you add to the diet, the less growth that you see. So a take-home message from a study like this would be, okay, I'm going to conduct more experiments with dried ova as a replacement. 20% is going to be my top, and then maybe I'm going to look at 10% and 5% and see what that does, and if that affects growth differentially. I mentioned the use of BioFloc as a feed. And so this is an example of one of the studies that we have done with dried BioFloc. And here we replaced fish meal with 2 levels of dried BioFloc from our system, 25% or 50% replacement. And you can see basically the same type of results as with the dried ova. No difference in survival, but a big difference in growth, the control diet and the BioFloc diets. So my take-home message from a study like this would be, okay, I want to look at things a lot less than a 25% replacement, maybe 20% as my top, 10% and 5%. So I mentioned alternative diets. So we'll move on to studies that we have done with bivalves in the past. For this particular study, we looked at completely replacing a live diet. Those are treatments 5 and 6, or a partial replacement diet of 50% with an off-the-shelf microalgae concentrate, or using live microalgae. And we worked with 2 different clam species for this particular study, the quahog, the northern hard clam, and which you'll hear a lot about today, and the sunray Venus clam, which is an alternative clam species in aquaculture. So what you can see that we found with this particular study was that the concentrate diets, if you fed 100% concentrate, and this was over 6 weeks, neither clam species did very well as far as either growth or survival. But if you looked at partial replacement, you saw a species-specific response. So as far as survival, it was no different between the 2 species and between a live microalgae diet. When it came to growth, with the hard clam, we didn't see a difference. The hard clam's in blue compared to the live diets, but we definitely saw a decrease with the sunray Venus clam when they were fed a partial replacement diet with those microalgae concentrates. So the take-home message from this is you need to tailor your feed to different species. You can't just assume that, okay, a clam's a clam, and they'll respond the same way to the same types of feed. And we found that when we worked with live microalgae as well. So now we're going to move on. Like I said, I'm going to give you a little snapshot, a little taste of everything we've done. So the next one we were going to talk about was culture systems and culture conditions. When you think of a culture system, you probably think of ponds, raceways, tanks. They can be either open or closed, flow through or recirculating. And all these different culture systems are going to utilize different water sources. So a pond, for instance, may take things from a stream that's close to it. A tank may be filled with, if it's located along the coast, might be filled with coastal water. It might be filled with well water. And all those different water sources are going to vary as far as composition and type of water quality that they have. So they may vary in salinity and therefore mineral composition. They may vary in pH. They may vary with the type of pathogens that you bring in when you use those different water sources. And we're going to talk about pathogens later as well. Here at Harbor Branch, we used closed systems. We rely on tanks, recirculating aquaculture systems, and the integrated multi-trophic aquaculture system. Our source water is well water. A lot of people think when they come here and they take a visit that we take our water out of the Indian River Lagoon. We don't. We have a salt well water and a fresh well water that that's our water source. When I talk about systems, and we talk about systems in a couple of slides, we can also talk about clear water systems versus biofloc systems. You've had a little bit of introduction into biofloc already. And a clear water system would simply be something that, okay, I take this directly from a well, or I take this directly from a stream. So jumping into biofloc versus clear water. One thing I didn't mention about biofloc, and this is a picture of a shrimp biofloc tank. You can see the water looks brown. That has to do with the biofloc. In addition to providing perhaps some nutrition due to the bacteria and the plankton in the water, biofloc can also improve water quality. The bacteria will convert the nitrogenous compounds like ammonia into something that is less toxic for the animals. And as I mentioned, our source water is well water. But for some of our experiments, we use that exclusively. With others, we use our IMTA water, and that's recirculated, and it's recirculated for a number of years with a small input of water from the well. And so that makes it a different type of water from a water quality perspective, perhaps, and from the minerals that are found in that water. This is an example of a biofloc culture experiment. I'm not going to show you growth and survival of the shrimp in there. I'll just tell you that they did very well. But what I wanted to show you here was the potential nutrition that biofloc systems can provide. So this was a 12-week study. And what I wanted to show you was a change over time with the zooplankton population. So at the beginning, we had a lot of variety, and as we come to the end of the 12-week study, you can see that we have a changeover, still a lot of flagellates, but everything else has been perhaps grazed by the shrimp. If we take a look at the bacteria in the system, we can also see a turnover right about in the middle of the experiment. So our type of bacteria now has changed from about 6 weeks to 8 weeks. And you can see these different colors represent different taxonomic categories of bacteria. When it comes to the planktonic organisms, which would be your synonymous to microalgae, you can see that it was consumed greatly and grazed on all the way from that 12-week period by the shrimp in the system. A lot of the experiments that we conduct have more than one thing that we're looking at a time. And although we will talk, so here we have a combination of a dietary experiment and a culture system. We have done some work with amphipods. What are amphipods? They're crustaceans, but what are they used for? They're used to feed fish, cephalopods, in their larval stages. So they are a live food source. Other live food sources that are used in the industry are things like copepods and rotifers. For this particular experiment, we looked at the differences in production in both a clear water and a biofloc system, and with 3 different diets. So we were looking at 2 different things simultaneously. And what we found is that we got twice the density or the amount of amphipods in a biofloc system, and it was statistically different. We didn't really see an effect with diet. There were some some slight differences, but they were not significant. This is another experiment where we were looking at water and diet at the same time. And this one was conducted with sea cucumbers. For this particular experiment, we looked at water source, as I mentioned before, the well water, versus the IMTA water. And for one of the treatments, we filtered the water because, as I said, the IMTA water recirculates continuously, and it can have a lot of micro and organisms in it. A lot of plankton, perhaps, organic material, and even amphipods, as we found out in this particular experiment. And we also looked at different diets. We didn't find any significant difference in survival for the treatments, but we did see lower growth in the unfiltered IMTA water right here. We were able to go back and attribute that to the presence of amphipods, which were preying on the sea cucumbers and causing lesions, so they were an irritant. And that is not an uncommon thing with people who culture sea cucumbers. Amphipods actually can be a predatory species with sea cucumbers. Again, we saw no difference between our dietary treatments. So, diets, culture systems, now we're going to talk about culture conditions. We pay a lot of attention to culture conditions and water quality in aquaculture. And that is because having optimal culture conditions will lead to increased production. It needs to be pointed out that these conditions are going to vary, sometimes based on life stage, but also based on what are you looking at, survival, growth, or reproduction. Because as you go from survival to reproduction, it may narrow as to what those optimal conditions are. Things that we have looked at quite a bit in our research here at Harbor Branch have been salinity experiments. Salinity can be categorized as fresh, brackish, or marine or saline. Brackish can be very wide in scope as to what's considered brackish, all the way from 0.5 parts per thousand up to 30 parts per thousand, where it becomes saline or marine water. I tend to think as brackish for the culture experiments we've done, more in the 5 to 15 parts per thousand range. And it would be what you would find in an estuary, for instance. Temperature, I don't think I need to explain what temperature is, but we do the temperature experiments. And pH, a lot of our current and future research is focused on pH experiments. So what is pH? You may know that 7 is neutral, but it's a measure of acidity and basicity. And one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is as I go from a 7 to an 8 on the pH scale, it's not it's a 10-fold difference, not a 1-fold difference. pH can vary based on water source, salinity, and some species do very well in slightly acidic waters, while others, particularly marine species, prefer a higher pH. So it can vary quite a bit. Some of the first experiments I did at Harbor Branch were based on salinity and inland aquaculture with shrimp. So with shrimp, they have different life stages in different types of water. So for the adults and for reproductive purposes, they're out in the open ocean. So that means full strength seawater, a marine environment. As they develop through those stages that were mentioned earlier, they migrate back towards the estuary. They come more inland where the water is brackish. And until they become adult and they get ready to reproduce, they stay in those areas. So that allows those who want to grow shrimp for human consumption, They don't have to rely on having their facility located in the coast. They can have a facility more inland. As long as they have somewhat brackish water, the shrimp will do well. In very early experiments, we found that 5 parts per thousand was very good for shrimp culture. And we got really good results as far as growth compared to full-strength salt water. One of the things to point out about doing freshwater, we call it freshwater shrimp culture, it's really brackish water, is that throughout the United States, we do have slightly saline water. We have that in Florida in the southeastern United States, and we also have slightly saline water or brackish water out west. However, the mineral profiles can vary greatly depending on the aquifer that they draw their water from. In addition, when you are culturing shrimp at low salinities, minerals can be depleted over time. It can be taken up by the soil or by the animals themselves. So we did some experiments, quite a few, looking at first developing acceptable ranges. What were the minimum and maximum mineral requirements for the most used minerals and the minerals that made up most of the salinity in the water. And those were magnesium, potassium, and calcium. And you can see here with the asterisks, those we had significant lower survival. And so right here for magnesium, for instance, would be the sweet spot. Here we've got too much magnesium. This level of magnesium is too low. And both of those result in 50% mortality. So what can you do with this data? Well, you can determine, do I need to add magnesium or potassium or calcium to my water source? And then we did a lot of additional experiments after this one, looking at the interaction of these different minerals and how those affected shrimp. We're going to switch gears here, and we're going to go from marine to freshwater. Although most of our experiments done here at Harbor Branch involve marine species, we do occasionally work with freshwater species. And for a while, a couple of years, we had apple snails on campus. We use them for teaching purposes because for teachers, freshwater is, the aquariums in the schools are mostly freshwater, not marine. We worked with the apple snail quite a bit. And why the apple snail? Well, it's a main food source for the Florida snail kite. The Florida snail kite is an endangered bird in Florida. Everglade populations of both the bird and the snail have declined, and the migration has been upwards, so now we see populations closer to the Orlando area, not in the Everglades anymore. And that has been thought to be done to saltwater intrusion in the Everglades and drought. And things like this we felt could continue to be an issue with climate change in the future. And so we did some experiments that focused on salinity with these snails. And what we found, if we take a look at survival was fine all the way up to 8 parts per thousand at 4 weeks, but it declined significantly at 4 and 8 parts per thousand by 8 weeks of culture. And right off the bat, 8 parts per thousand was just too high for good growth to take place. However, once the experiment was over, we returned the snails that had survived back to freshwater conditions, and they started to catch up in size with the other snails that had been kept at lower salinities, such as 0 or 2 parts per thousand. And so this suggests that temporary exposure to high salinity doesn't have a lasting effect with these snails, which is a good thing. So now we're going to talk about temperature. We've talked about salinity. Now we're going to look at temperature. Back to the amphipods. As I mentioned, they're a live food source for marine animals. And our goal here was to determine, okay, what is the optimal temperature to culture these at? Because there wasn't much out in the literature, particularly with the species that we were working with, that we actually took from the IMTA system. It likes to grow in our ulva tanks, and also, as I mentioned, in the IMTA system. So let's take advantage of a product, another, quote, byproduct that is part of that system. And let's work with it and see what we can find. So we looked at growth, survival, reproduction, and weight and length. I'm just going to show you some length experiments. And this study was carried out for 12 weeks for the purposes of growth. We got hit by one of our infamous hurricanes in between and stopped our growth studies because they weren't fed for a week, but we continued on looking at how that affected survival. And what we found by doing all those different experiments and looking at growth, survival, and reproduction is that of the 4 temperatures we looked at, 20 degrees Celsius, 23, 26, and 29, that the sweet spot appeared to be 26. For those that aren't familiar with what Celsius is, that would be about 78 degrees Fahrenheit. pH, as I mentioned, a lot of our current studies are focused on pH, and that's going to be the focus of a lot of our future studies here at Harbor Branch as well. You probably are very familiar with hearing about high carbon dioxide levels and how that is absorbed by the ocean, and it changes the pH of the ocean. As it lowers the pH, it also has a dual effect of making fewer carbonate ions available, and these carbonate ions are important for shelled organisms, be that coral or clams and oysters, and even some types of plankton that have shells. So what that results in is the lower your pH goes, you have fewer or smaller shelled organisms, and you can have some deformed organisms as well when it comes to shells. So here's some recently completed research that we have done at Harbor Branch. Richard Baptiste and I, along with a summer intern, took a look at pH, low pH 7.4, pH 8, which is optimal, and fluctuating pH. And what we found, and this was an 8-week study, that the clams reared at that lower pH were smaller, they had less calcium in their shells, and they had higher amounts of Vibrio, which to us indicated that maybe their immune system was a little compromised, that they were stressed out. Jim Masterson did some experiments with a student as well, and he looked at more the ecological implications. So clams that were reared in a substrate, a sand substrate, they were a little larger to start with. He did not do these in the IMTA system, so he didn't have the fluctuating pH. And although they didn't see a difference in growth, they did see a delay in the time that the clams buried into the sand. And that provides some predation, some hiding from predation if they can bury and get away from them. And both of us, as I said, we're going to continue on those studies this summer. We also did one of those dual experiments again because, you know, it's nice to do, okay, salinity does this, temperature does this, pH does this, DO does this, and to tease those out by doing individual experiments, but that's not how the world works. That's not how the water is. You may have fluctuations in all those different things going on at the same time. So interaction experiments or synergistic experiments are important to do as well. For this particular one, we did this in the IMTA system too, looked at pH 8, that optimal pH, and fluctuating pH, and we looked at 2 different temperatures. The only significant difference we found in this study was in growth. And when we did all the math, we attributed to the differences in growth, they were driven by temperature, not by pH. But we had kind of found that out with a previous experiment, that fluctuating pH didn't seem to bother the clams very much. Now, this is a good thing if you want to try to grow clams or oysters in the IMTA system, because it means that up and down fluctuating pH that occurs overnight and during the day doesn't seem to impact growth, survival, or the health of clams. So now let's switch gears with a different type of environment. Environmental contaminants. We can categorize these 2 ways. They can be a result of human activity, so pollution, or they can be a result of just the natural environment, like harmful algal blooms. We were fortunate enough after the Deep Horizon spill to be funded to do some research with oil and dispersants, oil from that well, as well as the dispersants used to contain it. Oil, although necessary in our daily lives, contains a lot of toxins. There are many ways that you can contain an oil spill. You can burn the oil, you can use booms to keep it from spreading, or you can spray it with chemicals called dispersants. Dispersants don't make it go away. It looks like they make it go away, but what they really do is they decrease the size of the oil droplets. That's not a good thing for small critters in the ocean or the estuaries, because now big oil droplets that they couldn't eat because they were too big become available to them in the water column. And larval animals are very indiscriminate feeders in their early age. We conducted research with larval shrimp, and instead of using the Penaeid shrimp that you would eat, we chose to work with pink shrimp, which are found in the Gulf of Mexico and are part of the fisheries industry. We looked at the effect on oysters, and we also looked at the effect of conch, because at that time it was thought that the oil was going to be carried by currents around the tip of Florida and even out to the Atlantic. Fortunately, that didn't happen, but we wanted to look at the effect on conch as well. And then, of course, their food sources. So these are 2 busy-looking graphs, but they give a good picture of what we found. WAF, or water accommodated fraction, is the oil. So this is a graph about the oil. CWAF, chemically enhanced water accommodated fraction, is dispersed oil. What's an LC50? It's the concentration at which 50% of the animals die. And so if you take a look at the 2 and you contrast, and even though the scale's slightly different, I think you can see that the dispersed oil has a much more negative effect on larval animals than does the oil itself. Another thing to point out is obviously the longer they're exposed to it, the more negative the effect is. That just makes common sense. The animal and the life stage that was most sensitive to both of these was the shrimp zoea stage. So we looked at 4 shrimp stages, 3 conch stages, and 2 oyster stages. One of the things that we determined, why is the shrimp zoea more susceptible to the effects of both oil and dispersed oil than the nauplii stage that was discussed earlier? Well, during the nauplii stage, they don't eat. The zoea stage is the first stage that shrimp will open up their mouths and begin eating. And so that's why we saw a differential effect. Another thing to point out is older animals were not as negatively affected. So here's your oldest stage of shrimp. There's your eyed oysters compared to your D-stage oysters.
I have a question. Are you saying that it would be better for them not to use the dispersants and just leave the oil for the life cycles?
Well, I think we'll take questions later. That's kind of a loaded question, but I guess we want to say it does. Yes. Okay. You are correct. You are correct. As far as the effects on plankton, we saw very similar effects. So the oil alone didn't seem to affect microalgae cell division or motility of algae, nor did it impact mortality of zooplankton. In this case, we use rotifers as our proxy animal because it was easily available in an aquaculture setting. But when we added the dispersant, we saw decreases in cell division, decreases in motility, which is what this graph is showing you, and also increased mortality. Moving on to pathogen research. This is one of my, I guess I could say, favorite areas of research. It's what I got my PhD in, was shrimp virus research. And I do a lot of pathogenics research, and I have a lab that certifies the industry, clams, oysters, and shrimp, and feed for shrimp as far as do they have pathogens in them or not, so that they can be transported throughout the United States and internationally. So pathogen research involves a lot of surveillance. It's got a lot of epidemiology associated with it. Why do we do it? We want to see what species are affected, a broad range of species, a narrow species. We want to be able to stop its progression to respond to pathogens. And this has become an area of concern with climate change as we have warmer temperatures. Is there a range expansion with pathogens? So how does the environment affect the spread of disease? We look at things like prevalence, that's the number of animals that are affected in a given location, and intensity, the level of infection. Another type of research we do with pathogens are the use of additives to either boost the immune system or to decrease disease progression. And these pictures here are of a shrimp viral disease that we work with. Jim talked a lot about the shrimp aquaculture industry. 55% of the shrimp consumed are from aquaculture. Now, this is just shrimp in general. When you talk about pennated shrimp, like the white shrimp, that jumps up to about 80%. However, about $4 billion a year are lost due to diseases. And the two primary diseases that are still of concern are white spot syndrome virus, which you saw in the previous slide, and acute hepatopancreatic necrosis disease, which is actually caused by a Vibrio bacteria. There's an organization called the World Organization of Aquatic Health that polices what species that the various diseases are found in, where they are currently found, and this is not just for the aquatic industry and the shrimp industry, it's for all aquatic animals as well as for all terrestrial animals. So what's some of the shrimp pathogen research that we do here? Well, we look at adding, as I said, dietary additives to shrimp feed. Things like probiotics, which are good bacteria that outcompete bad bacteria, or immunostimulants, which are additives that boost the immune system. Think maybe about things like vitamins. The first thing we do is to see do those enhance production, growth, and survival. And then we take animals that have been fed for a while with those additives and we expose them to one of those two diseases and we look to see whether survival is increased. So this is a graph of a couple of products at a couple different levels where we followed survival after infection with white spot syndrome virus. This is a control. It didn't receive the additive, and you can see we had 100% mortality. And then you can see various levels of protection with different levels in different products here. So those are some of the research studies that we do with shrimp pathogens. Another type of shrimp pathogen research we do is looking at bacterial constructs that are engineered and target either the proteins within the viruses or the genes within the bacteria. It's very similar to the previous slide, except we're not worried here about growth and survival at all. We're just worried about whether or not we see an increase in survival by using these products. And these products, the idea is they will be incorporated into feed, and think of them like as a engineered vaccine, basically, is what they are. And we have a challenge area where we do this that has a number of different types of tanks and systems. So this brings us to our last category, which are monitoring studies. What is a monitoring study? A monitoring study is just collecting data to measure some type of progress. That allows you to determine if you need to make changes. In aquaculture, we use this to look at what are our baseline conditions in a facility, for instance, or to determine the success of restoration efforts. And so here's a recent study that we conducted that just was completed this past summer, where we monitored various clam hatcheries and nurseries across the state of Florida for water quality, bacteria, and for nurseries plankton. And we produced a plethora of data, which is located at the UF-IFAS Florida Shellfish Aquaculture site. And if you're interested in bivalves in general, this is a wonderful site, has a lot of resources, and it's a very go-to site. The last category within that monitoring is just monitoring oyster reefs. You probably are all aware of the ecological benefits that they provide, and that there's focus on restoration, which will be talked at next workshop. So when we monitor oyster reefs, whether they're artificial or existing reefs, we look at a lot of things: water quality, recruitment of new babies, how they're growing, how they're surviving, and we also look at the prevalence and intensity of diseases and pests. This is just an example of some of the pest and physiological conditions that we monitor for. So you can see we do a lot just on the disease progression end of this. And this particular study looked at 3 areas within the Indian River Lagoon, both natural and artificial reefs, and how they varied. So what's next? As I mentioned, we're going to continue those pH studies. We're also working on developing a shrimp challenge system for larval shrimp. Our current challenge systems are all for juveniles. And then any industry-driven type of studies that will come our way. We work, as I said, closely with industry. And so just to wrap this up, it's a team effort from both funding, from who we work with, students, couldn't do it without students, couldn't do it without our industry partners. We work a lot with University of Florida on our bivalve projects in particular. And thank you for your patience. I see I've went over time a little bit.
All right, thank you, Susan. As you guys can see, we do quite a bit of aquaculture research here. We have done for quite a few years. But now we're going to kind of pivot. Instead of talking about research, we're going to talk about the aquaculture industry here in Florida. So our next presentation is going to be from Sarah Curry. She moved to Miami in 2011 to work with a small production company that was doing fish farm documentaries. She founded Soraya Films in 2016 to continue this educational film work. Sarah had ideas for the series after realizing it was difficult to find local sustainable seafood in South Florida. I'm sure we can all agree to that. And the series has evolved, and after the pandemic, it focused more on Florida seafood producers. So the series is available online, and we're going to be watching today episode 8 called Sun Shrimp. So please give a warm welcome to Sarah.
Thanks so much for that intro. I can skip ahead a little. Welcome. This has been really cool. I love learning about these topics, which is why I'm excited I get to do this job. I founded Sereia Films. It means mermaid in Portuguese. And we have 10 films available online and on South Florida PBS covering these issues. And we have 2 more available shortly in the next couple of months. About half of them are about aquaculture. And I want to give you a little more depth about how I came to be making films about seafood. I'm from Louisiana and grew up eating crawfish, the regional delicacy, and farmed catfish. And I fell in love with the ocean when I was 14 and got certified to scuba dive and studied marine biology at LSU and moved to the Northeast to work on commercial fishing boats after college. So I was a fisheries observer, and I got to see industrial fishing, and my job was to see what they were catching it and what they were also throwing away, so the bycatch. And it really gave me a unique perspective on kind of commercial fish food production. And so I went to graduate school to study environmental journalism in Boulder, and that's where I fell in love with filmmaking. And so for my graduate project, I came back to Louisiana and learned where the other half of our fish comes from, which is aquaculture. And I was out in rural Louisiana at catfish farms and tilapia farms. And here we are. So I'm going to play this video real quick, and then we can get out for a break and chat more later. And I'm hope the audio is good. The ocean is an incredible place. Let's keep it that way. Join us as we hunt for sustainable seafood. Our seafood choices matter for the future of ocean health. Hey, I'm Sarah Curry with Sereia Films. Shrimp is the most consumed seafood in the world, but most of us likely don't know what fresh shrimp even tastes like. 90% of what we're eating here in the U.S. is imported. In this episode, we're visiting a farm located in South Florida, working hard to make shrimp for U.S. consumers.
People have this concept that, oh, shrimp are fresh. They're seeing them in the case at their local grocery store. There's no such thing as a fresh shrimp anymore. All the shrimp are frozen, especially stuff coming from overseas. It comes in containers that's frozen and many months old. We consume 1.6 billion. We import roughly 90% of that. It's really unfortunate, but pretty much every shrimp you see on the shelf today in America has been treated. I would say 99% has been treated with something. The use of chemical preservatives and all kinds of lotions and potions to make the shrimp gain weight and to make them look better than what they are, that is very much in use all over the world. And we say, look, it's not necessary. There's a market for that shrimp. People are eating it. People like it. But we want to do something better. We want to create a better thing. We can sell a product that hasn't been treated, and that is quite unique.
The farm is located on the west coast of Florida, past a historic fishing town on 70 acres of land. It's where Robin Pearl has been working since 2013 to raise the perfect shrimp. It takes a skilled team of people, from technicians to water quality experts to geneticists, to even stand a chance in producing a sustainable, high-quality shrimp here in the U.S. The team at Sun Shrimp is creating a shrimp free from preservatives, free from antibiotics, with almost no environmental impacts. The first stop on the farm is where the magic happens. These tanks contain the highest quality male and female shrimp, and this is where they mate. While they're here, they're fed a special diet of worms and squid, and the tanks mimic natural spawning conditions.
This right here is a male. You can see that he has his sperm right there. That's how we know if he's a male or a female.
Okay.
And then this one right here, this is a female. And if you could tell from her back, you could see all her little eggs are accumulated
those
right
are the
here.
eggs. Okay.
Yeah.
The males sense when the females are ready to spawn and start chasing them. The strongest male in the tank deposits a sperm packet on the underside of the female. When she spawns, the eggs go through the sperm packet.
I'll select the females that are mated, see if they have the spermatophores on, and if they do, I'll take them to the spawning room where they'll release their eggs and do their thing.
And how many shrimp can come out of one spawning?
Out of a female, you could expect anywhere from 100 to 300,000 eggs, usually over 100,000 nauplii per female.
After 12 to 24 hours, the eggs hatch, and the newborn shrimp are called nauplii. It's important to know how many nauplii are produced from one pair of shrimp, and the microscopic shrimp are attracted to Gabriel's flashlight, which allows him to collect a sample so they can be counted.
I think the hardest part about maturation is how delicate everything is, all the process from stage to stage. Everything has to be disinfected, clean, properly fed, properly maintained, so you can have good results. I mean, I love my job. Every day is a new little challenge, and you always get to see the results of what you produce, knowing that I'm producing shrimp for the whole world, pretty much.
So the farm it's really vertically integrated. It's not like there's a big industry to support you. If I were in India, there's hundreds of hatcheries, there's hundreds of processing plants, there's lots of different feed companies. Here in America, we don't have that. So we kind of need to do these things internally.
Lorena is in charge of larvoculture at the farm, and she just received a batch of baby shrimp from Gabriel. This is where the shrimp will spend the first 3 weeks of their lives. During that time, the shrimp undergo many changes, which is why survivorship at this stage is extremely difficult.
Mi nombre es Lorena Cabaleira, soy española y ahora americana también. Llevo en esta empresa 6 años. Empecé trabajando en la planta, descabezando camarones y empaquetando. Y de ahí tuve un cambio de jefe y él me metió en larva, me enseñó todo lo que sé ahora. Realmente nunca había trabajado en camarones, pero me encanta mi trabajo. Camarón tiene diferentes etapas, lo que es SOEA 1, SOEA 2 y SOEA 3, MISIS 1, MISIS 2, MISIS 3 y ya luego PL. Cada etapa lleva su diferente comida que tú tienes que, no puedes mezclarla.
Every day, Lorena makes a different diet for each stage. Some are fed a liquid diet, some a solid diet, and some shrimp are fed algae, which is grown on site. It's grown in a biosecure, self-cleaning machine. The farm also regularly collects data on the shrimp. As part of this, Lorena measures the shrimp's average length, which helps determine growth rates and uniformity of the batch.
Donde tú siempre tienes que estar muy atento es en los productos que tú echas, revisar los tanques todos los días, sus cambios de agua, sus temperaturas, la comida. Hay diferentes tipos de comida, diferentes horas y siempre tienes que estar encima de eso. Es muy importante porque realmente es el bebé, por decirlo así, del camarón. Si aquí no hay larva, no va a haber producción en la granja.
The ability to grow shrimp in America is very, very difficult. You need to have warm temperatures, you need salt water, and there's not that many places in America where you can do that. We dug a deep well. We went 1,800 feet deep to get tap into an aquifer that is really not used by anyone. It's too salty, but for us it's perfect. This is very much a unique type of setting on this island to be able to do what we're doing.
There's 150 tanks in the grow-out area housing millions of shrimp, where they live 5 months until they reach full size. For ease of operation, Robin and the team set up automatic feeders that keep the shrimp happy and stress-free by feeding them pellets every 20 seconds, 24 hours a day. They also live in what's called a bioflux system. This bacteria-based culture cleans the water while also providing supplemental food for the shrimp. The greenhouses the tanks are housed in provide the sunshine that helps this bioflux system thrive.
Labor cost is number one, feed cost is number two, and energy cost is number three. We're currently expanding. Once we expand, then definitely feed costs will become number one.
It takes a lot of feed to raise millions of shrimp, and not all the feed is the same. Sun Shrimp relies on the expertise of Tim, the director of husbandry, who's been doing this for 20 years. There's a ton of feed in here. How long will all of this last you?
This is about 2 weeks worth.
How long have you been doing this, and what have you seen change in the feed since you've been a shrimp farmer?
So I've been doing this for 20 years, and I guess the biggest thing that's really changed has been the replacement of the fish meal and the reduction in the amount of fish meal used in these feeds.
Shrimp feed typically consists of fish meal, fish oil, soy, wheat, vitamins, and minerals. You can actually smell the fish meal and fish oil in it. The fish meal in Sun Shrimp's feed is sourced from MSC certified fisheries, and the feed itself is made here in the United States.
Fish meal is a finite resource, and we need to do as much as we can, produce as much as we can using as little as possible. As aquaculture grows, which it is growing quickly, it is a finite resource, so we're going to have to be able to use less and less of it, even though we're producing more fish, more shrimp.
And so what would be kind of replacing some of that fish meal and fish oil?
You have some single-celled proteins, bacteria mostly. Insect meals would be another. Plant proteins. There is some pressure from the consumers. Obviously, you grow the fish, you have to sell the fish. And if this is what the consumer wants, you have to respond to that.
Originally, our goal when we built this farm was to provide food shrimp in America. That was our goal. And we ran into trouble. Our shrimp were not living and they were dying. So it turned out that it was purely a genetic issue.
Sometimes it takes failing to find solutions. In order to consistently raise a successful crop of shrimp, Robin decided to build an in-house genetics lab in order to study, monitor, and to some degree control the breeding process.
I'm unaware of any shrimp farms that have this level of a genetics lab. We built it on farm, it's not outsourced. We run thousands of samples per day and millions of data points throughout the year to breed a better shrimp. Our process starts with collecting the samples and inventorying them, knowing where they came from, where they were born, which are their parents. From that point, we then perform DNA extraction. So it's a procedure of extracting the DNA out of shrimp that we can then analyze. So what you see behind me on this screen are 4 different families of shrimp. And we will combine these different families in the same tank and study their performance. So by sampling them at different time points, we can understand which families survive best in particular conditions. Some of the traits that we look at, we select first for survival. That's what makes us unique. Second is growth. A distant third would be fecundity. And beyond that, uniformity is kind of like a must-have. You must have uniformity to be competitive. And with the genetics, we can reproduce successes. So if you have a great crop that year and you want to order the same shrimp next year, with this technology, I can tell you which broodstock you'll be getting to have that success again. We simply look at the shrimp's DNA to understand where they come from, how they're related, and minimizing inbreeding. Regarding genetic modification, that is not the purpose or goal of this lab. There's no genetic manipulation or anything like that.
Another special thing about this farm is that it's in constant production. Every day, hundreds of thousands of shrimp are born, and hundreds of thousands of shrimp are harvested. Once a day, the water from every tank is sampled for ammonia, nitrite, salinity, and suspended solids. Dissolved oxygen is also measured every 3 to 4 hours. Ultimately, all the water on the farm is reused or is cleaned on site, so dirty water is never pumped back into the environment.
Mi nombre es María Tecum y tengo 26 años. Empecé a trabajar aquí a los 19 y yo soy de Guatemala. Hace 2 años aprendí a hacer calidad de agua, como estoy haciendo. Es muy importante porque así podemos saber si los tanques, si los camarones están bien. Entonces es muy importante hacer todos los días.
Today they're harvesting a small batch of about 50 pounds for an order that just came in. The shrimp are harvested live and immediately go into an ice slurry, which preserves the quality of the shrimp. The shrimp is then tractored over to an on-site processing plant, which is a 5-minute ride away. The quick harvest, quick chill, and quick access to a processing facility is rare in the shrimp farming industry.
Basically, up until very recently, the way that you process a shrimp is doing it by hand. You manually behead it, and you manually peel it and devein it. It's very much a manual process. We've been working with a company named Novatech, and they have developed a thing called the ShrimpWorks machine, which we've been their development partner for the past couple of years. The system is able to behead, peel, and devein fully automatically, and it comes up with a unique product where the vein is removed when the head is removed, and we don't have to cut the actual tail. It's the first of its kind.
Having a mechanized deheader is one crucial piece that makes the farm possible at this scale. But quality control, packing, and shipping still requires a solid team in order to get the shrimp ready to ship domestically and around the world so quickly after harvest. Michael's Genuine in Miami's upscale design district works to source ingredients that match their farm-to-table mentality. And this Florida farm shrimp is right at home on their menu.
We really like the sun shrimp here because it comes in super fresh. We call them up, and the next day they deliver it. They pull it out of the water. They're harvested to order. So their freshness is really unparalleled, which is weird because we're in Miami. You would think that shrimp is just swimming up into the boats and then coming into the restaurant, but that's not how it works. The boats go out and then they harvest the shrimp, and then they freeze it on board. And so most of the time we don't see the shrimp until it's months old. And this one comes in next day, very fresh and pristine quality. So the dish that we did with the sun shrimp is sort of a Southeast Asian approach. We poach them and then save the heads. We marinate them with some nook cham, which is like fish sauce and chilies and garlic, and sort of a really light approach to it so we don't overpower the shrimp. And then we fry the heads crispy to give it some crunch and a little bit more flavor. We get inspired by it. You know, it's something that we want to feature and make sure that we don't cook too much of it or overcook it, and we treat it right. We talk about it to our guests. And sun shrimp really fits into what we do here because it's a local product that we embrace because of its freshness and its quality.
But it doesn't take an award-winning chef to enjoy these shrimp. These shrimp are also delicious over a bed of rice from a food truck. It's awesome to eat a local, sustainably raised shrimp, but what sets this shrimp apart is how delicious it is. This shrimp has a 10 to 15-day shelf life with no preservatives, and it's grown sustainably right here in the United States at a relatively large scale. This is an incredible feat and what I hope the future of shrimp farming looks like.
All right. Wasn't that video great? Yeah. All of the videos that we've seen from Soraya Films have been amazing. So definitely go home and enjoy some more of those episodes if you haven't already. So it's now time for our break. Please feel free to get out, stretch your legs. You are more than welcome to go out to the back of the gallery and look at the channel. Please just stay close to our education building. And let's see, what time is it? 9:45. Let's try to be back here by 11:05, okay? Testing, testing. Can you hear me, Joey? Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Okay. All right, everybody. I think we're going to jump back into it. Hopefully you were able to stretch your legs during the break. We have two more really exciting presentations coming up, and then to wrap up the morning, we are going to have a panel discussion, which is why we have this long table here. So just a reminder, if you think of any questions during the next few presentations, write them down, make a mental note so that you can bring them up during the panel discussion so that everybody can hear them. Okay, so up next we have Michael Bobbitt. He is from Cedar Key. He made a long trip today. He is presenting on the Florida Shellfish Plan. Michael Bobbitt is also going to be screening his film, Rise of the Clambassador. So we're all very excited for that. And he's going to be presenting about the clam industry in Cedar Key, Florida. The presentation will give an overview of the clam industry as it continues to recover from the devastation of Hurricane Idalia, as well as a discussion about the Florida Shellfish Plan and the intention to use it to promote the industry and seek institutional and governmental help for Florida to reclaim its position as the nation's farm-raised clam leader. So we're going to start with Clambassador, and then the Clambassador will come up and speak with us.
It's hard work being in the clam business. There are periods of really difficult manual labor, but it ain't all hard work. And a lot of times, those little jokers are just sitting out there like a cash register, just ding, 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 growing.
The issues aren't the clams, that's the easy part. And it's not the work. All work is what you put into it. The hard part is that you deal with nature day in and day out, and that's a moving target. You know, nature, it does what it wants to. Florida produces a very high number of shellfish for the United States, and Cedar Key produces a very high number for Florida.
Pretty quickly, you find out that the entire economy and really the culture of the island is founded on aquaculture, on clam farming. When I finally made the decision to move here, I just wanted to be all in with Cedar Key, and I didn't feel like I could really be part of Cedar Key if I wasn't doing what people in Cedar Key do. Up one day and you're like, I want to get in the Cedar Key clam business. It's not that easy. You don't just, there's no clam college, there's no class to take. It took me moving here and really getting to know people, becoming a part of the community, volunteering, helping folks out, begging people to let me on their boats to see how it works. The biggest help I got here on the island was the mayor, Heath Davis, and I became friends. And he has just a world-class clam operation here, and he's been incredibly generous and helpful with his time.
It's kind of refreshing to watch Michael. If you've ever been to a high school basketball game, you know, the freshman and the sophomore, they get off the bench. They're just so excited to be in the game. It's just raw adrenaline. And so as we watch Michael, we get a lot of enjoyment watching that raw adrenaline just go after it.
Put together a crew and bought a boat, and on our very first day, it was a giant thunderstorm. The tide was wrong. I got a massive order of clams. I don't know how we didn't sink the boat, but we got them out.
I wouldn't say Michael's screwing it up. He didn't know it, but he loves it too. That kind of snuck up on him. He just thought it was neat, thought he'd jump into it, and then he fell in love with it. Now he's stuck, like us.
Cedar Key is a tiny little sand heap of an island at the western terminus of State Road 24 out in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. We're at the mercy of the capricious whims of the ocean, basically. There's a real dual nature to the place. At high tide, it's beautiful. It's a glimmering tropical paradise. And at low tide, it's a festering, stinking mud hole. And a lot of folks say, they don't like that about it. I love that about it. The ugly's right out front where you can see it. I always know where I stand in Cedar Key.
shellfish industry provides the ability to filter a massive amount of water. Having the shellfish industry here cleans no telling how many, hundreds of millions of gallons.
These clams aren't indigenous to here. We brought them here. We have really nutrient-dense water, so we grow clams faster generally here than anywhere else in North America.
You go buy some clams, you get those clams, you put them in a bag, you lay them on the bottom. After a few months, you pull them, and you look at them, make sure they're good. You divvy them up into more bags so they got room to grow. You lay in there for a little bit longer, and you go back later and you harvest them and you take them to market.
Any fresh clams at Publix or Costco, anywhere in the country, look on the back of the bag and it'll probably say a product of Cedar Key. Today we planted 175 bags out there, so somewhere around 180,000, 185,000 clams went out in the ground today.
Man, my back is going to hurt this evening. It's going to be a 2-drink night tonight.
I jokingly one day photoshopped my head onto a Prussian military officer's uniform with clams on the lapel and called myself the Clambassador, and it just took off. I can't go anywhere on this island now where people are like, hey, it's a Clambassador, hey, Clambassador.
We always knew that somebody like the Clambassador needed to come to town, so we're glad he's here. We're glad it's not us.
And I do like to be an ambassador for the town, for our culture, for the aquaculture business. The Clambassador stands for what we do here. It stands for the unique culture we have here on this island that's propped up and sustained by the clam industry. It stands for the hardworking people here trying to make their own way out in the world. And it stands for the Gulf of Mexico that we all love so much. The Clambassador stands for all of that.
You know, the neat thing about the clamming is it is extremely rewarding. You know, you reach down, you touch it, and you feel it and all that, and that's all nice. But it's a little more than that. It's because it's the fact that you grew this beautiful product, and so when you get it up out of the soil and you shake it out, and you get it up there on the boat and you're looking at it, and yeah, there's this beautiful bag of clams, and it's always wet, so the sunlight's making it glisten and it's pretty, and all these fancy cameras y'all got, it would just be beautiful shot. You can't mess that up. You're proud. You're really proud. And the fact that everything that you did along that process was good for the environment, and it was good for the water quality and good for Cedar Key and everything, that makes you proud. I mean, everything that you do when you do that gives back. It's just such a hard industry to beat. I mean, it is the greatest industry that any community could have. And I don't know why everybody in Florida is not doing it.
Whereabouts? Just stand behind that? Okay. Hey, everybody. So thank you for checking out our movie. That thing has had a life all on its own. We made that film sort of as we thought it would just help promote the industry a little bit. And just on a whim, we entered it into a few film festivals.
and it just took off on the film festival circuit. It won festivals around the world. It won the International Ocean Film Festival in San Francisco, the Paris Short Film Festival. And a funny story, when I flew out to San Francisco to do the red carpet event for that movie, the director of the festival ran and grabbed me, and he said something along the lines of, when you do a film festival about the ocean and you accept 4,000 entrants, 3,999 of them show dead baby seals, dead whales, the ocean's boiling. When we got your hopeful film about you rednecks growing clams in Florida, we knew you were the winner. So by and large, the shellfish industry has been an amazing success story, and it is a really hopeful story. We have some existential threats to the industry that we're going to talk about, but by and large, there aren't many industries in the world or any instances in the world where industry and the environment work hand in hand in a symbiotic way. Since the Industrial Revolution, those two entities have almost always been at odds with one another. The history of Florida, sadly, is replete with stories of taking our natural resources and plundering them to the point of absolute collapse. Even on our island is called Cedar Key. You can hardly find a cedar tree in Cedar Key anymore because at the turn of the 20th century, by then they had harvested almost all of them for pencils to be shipped to pencil factories in New York City. And so the shellfish industry in Florida and specifically the clam industry in Cedar Key is something entirely different. I do a good bit of lobbying for the industry, and recently we were in Tallahassee and got to meet with the president pro tem there, or not the speaker pro tem, and the first thing out of his mouth he said is, anytime you clam farmers go anywhere, the first thing you ought to say to people is, it cleans the water. Our industry cleans the water. Everywhere on planet Earth where freshwater, saltwater, and land meet, those estuaries are among the most important environmental resources that we have, and the shellfish industry cleans that water. One of the reasons why we believe that our clams grow so well in Cedar Key is because we have some of the cleanest estuary water. We have a long stretch of shoreline that's entirely undeveloped, and our industry helps to promote that. So what I'm here to talk about today specifically is a thing called the Florida Shellfish Plan. Some of us on the island, in a partnership with industry folks and the University of Florida, hopefully Harbor Branch, we want to put out a plan that we can use to take to lawmakers, to take to other institutional people, and to take to the public to show them in a concise way why we ought to all care about the shellfish industry. Even if you don't like clams, or you don't like oysters. I can't stand oysters. I don't know why anybody would ever eat them. But they're an important resource for the estuary. So we want to be able to tell people why you want to get behind this plan. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the shellfish plan, and so I guess I just click here. Oh, the mouse. Boop. Oh, okay, down here. Gotcha. Here we go. Boom. So like we talked about before, like the congressman told us, we ought to be saying this everywhere we go. Without clean water, human life on Earth cannot flourish. It is the basic building block of human life. And shellfish clean the water. Whenever the state is deciding on areas where they're going to make these land leases for us to plant our clams, they almost always pick areas that are entirely ecological dead zones. Mud flats, sand, places where very little life happens. Within weeks of planting our clam bags, entire new ecosystems flourish around the clam bags. The shellfish filter so much of the water that more light can make its way into the water column, and we start to see more phytoplankton, which leads to more little fishies and more little crabs and more little all manner of life. Seagrasses happen because of the incredible work these shellfish do for the estuary. So like I mentioned earlier, shellfish farming, it really is a unique opportunity where we can all get behind something where the concerns of the economy and the concerns of the environment meet in a single goal. They operate hand in hand with one another. So the Shellfish Plan will talk specifically about the need to improve the water quality everywhere, coastal resiliency here in Florida, where Cedar Key has the very terrible distinction of being one of the 2 or 3 areas in all of North America most affected by coastal change, most affected by sea level rise. And if we can do something with our clams and our oysters to help prevent that, we want to. And we want to help protect the estuary for all the different marine ecosystems that happen there. So the Florida Shellfish Plan that we're creating will be a working document that we can use for advocacy. And these are the areas that we'll cover. The opportunity for growing the shellfish industry as an economic engine and an environmental conservation tool. Everywhere where someone will let me stand up in front of people and talk, I want to hammer this home. It just never happens. It's always the environment versus industry versus the environment, and the shellfish industry is something different. It's a really unique partnership. So one of the things, and I was just talking about this with Mr. Baptiste before we came up, there's been a real pushback from some of the old school people in the industry where we don't want to have rigorous data collection, we don't want to have scientists involved, we don't want to have government folks involved in our industry. A lot of the old school clammers view it as it's a good old boy network where it's all in-house. Like you saw in the film, I said, if a person wanted to become a clam farmer, there's no good way to do it. There's not a college. I can't go somewhere and say, teach me how to do this. And we've been guilty of putting up barriers. But one of the things we need to do is we need to detail the need for more vigorous data collection. When we have data, we can use that data to document the economic and environmental benefits to this industry. And good data is the basis for us to be able to show the government folks that if you give us resources, we're being a good steward of those resources. So data collection is a big deal. So I'm really here to ring the bell for the need for institutional support in the study of shellfish genetics and in making abundant, viable, good seed available for the industry. For a long while, Florida was the leader in farming shellfish in the country. And I'm sad to say that Virginia is kicking our heads in right now. We have the most amount of shoreline of any state in the country, and it ain't close. And a state known for antebellum plantations and government, they're killing us because they have recognized the environmental and economic benefits of this industry. Their legislature and their state university system is all in on supporting this industry. If you just go home and Google Virginia shellfish farming, there is resource after resource after resource, a team of geneticists and researchers working all the time to come up with hardy, heat-resistant, cold-resistant, disease-resistant clam seed that is then made readily available to their shellfish farmers in Virginia. There is a single shellfish farmer in Virginia that farms more acres and produces more clams than all of Cedar Key. Cedar Key is producing more than 90% of the clams for the entire state. A single clam farmer in Virginia is doing more than us with institutional support. If we want to continue to say that we're a leader in shellfish production, we can no longer do it in barns out over the water, in guys growing clams in buckets and not telling us how they came up with the seed. This is a real point of contention amongst the folks who want to keep the industry the way it's always been, and those of us that want to grow it into an absolute tool for helping the environment and for growing the economy of Florida. So we're calling for dedicated researchers, and we're calling for institutional support in the growing of seed. Folks like Mr. Baptiste and folks like Harbor Branch, they're here and ready and want to help, and we need to remove the barriers between industry and the folks that can provide this assistance to us. And anyone that will let me ring that bell, I'm going to come and ring it. So we're here for that. And then finally in the Shellfish Plan, if you come to Cedar Key, most of the 13 barrier islands that comprise the Cedar Keys are made up of middens. They're made up of table scraps from Timucuan Indians over the last 100,000 years. So we have folks at the University of Florida interested in documenting and studying the archaeological record of how shellfish production has happened over the course of thousands of years in Florida. It's only been in the last 200 years that the residents of Florida have learned how to completely exploit and to use up the natural resources. For thousands of years before that, the folks in this industry learned how to sustainably farm these products. So the Shellfish Plan will also highlight some of the efforts for to study the past, because the past truly is prologue to the present and the future. Let's see. And so finally, the Shellfish Plan, this is me upside down in the water, by the way. So the Shellfish Plan for Florida is going to be a roadmap to support and grow an industry that cleans the water, it feeds the people, and it grows the economy. And so I just think it's a beautiful opportunity for us to make money and to help the economy. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you guys here today, and hopefully during the panel discussion, if you have any questions. Oh, real quick, I know some of you wanted an update on how we did in Hurricane Idalia. I should have started with that. So that video was hopeful and wonderful, and it was also shot in the year before Hurricane Idalia. We took it on the chin in the island. I don't know anyone who lost less than 80% of their entire crop. Most farmers lost more than 90%. And while there are governmental disaster relief programs, 8 months since the storm now, 7.5 months since the storm, we're only just beginning to see some of that help. And for most farmers, it'll be another 2 to 3 months before they get that. We've missed an entire growing cycle. Only the most well-heeled, financially stable farmers have been able to buy any seed since the hurricane. The small mom-and-pop operations that are the real backbone of this industry are just out in the cold. We've lost approximately a third of all the farmers in Cedar Key because of the devastation of the hurricane. Back to the Shellfish Plan, when we have rigorous data collection, we're hoping to parlay that into a workable, sustainable, long-term crop insurance program. Without that data, it's just not a thing that can happen. So that's where we're at. The city is back, the town is back open for business. We're all back, all of us that are still in the business are out there planting and getting after it. But it's been a rough year. We probably have another rough year ahead of us, but we're not going to give up. So thank you so much for having me. I can't wait to answer your questions during the panel presentation.
All right. So thank you so much, Michael. Last but not least, we have Nicolette Mariano. She's the founder and CEO of Treasure Coast Shellfish. Her title is, for her presentation, is A Crazy Pioneer, the Only Oyster Farmer on the Treasure Coast. So this is going to be a really exciting presentation. Treasure Coast Shellfish LLC is in its 4th year of business and is currently the only woman-owned and operated oyster aquaculture farm on the east coast of Florida. It's located in Sebastian. We are going to start Nicolette's presentation with a preview to her short film that Soraya Films made about her farm. So this is just a teaser, and then she's going to come up and tell us all about her operation, and then we'll get to our panel discussion.
Almost all of the world's wild oyster beds have collapsed. But here on the east coast of Florida, in what was historically one of the most biologically diverse estuaries in North America, the Indian River Lagoon is home to an oyster farm that's helping this waterway and feeding people. The subtidal area where the farm is located receives pulses of salt water twice a day as the tide changes. And Nicolette Mariano, a young aquatic biologist, is doing what few people have done here.
Right now we're coming up to a cage that has our staged gold doubloons. So we'll grab it with a gaff first to help pull us to the boat and not slip. And then we'll grab the hook and use the davit to pull it up, so it's a lot easier on our backs.
There are 5 species of oysters that are commonly grown in North America, and multiple ways to grow these different oysters. Nicolette is growing her delicious Atlantic or East Coast oysters in floating cages. Each line has 14 cages on it, and each cage holds 4 bags of oysters. And even though she's growing one species, she divides them up into 2 different size groups in the bags.
So our Sebastian Silvers are 2.5 to 2 3/4 inches long. I say it's a play on our petite because you don't really hear of a petite oyster in the southern market. And then the gold doubloons are 3 to 3.5 inches. That's our larger oyster. On average, our salinity is around roughly about 28 parts per thousand. We've been having a higher salinity. The gold doubloons are briny all the way through, and the silvers are briny up front with a green and a little bit of a sweeter finish. You can hear by the sound, or if it's a oyster that's leaking, it sounds a little more hollow, or if it's completely dead, whether there's still meat in there or it's just an empty shell, it sounds hollow, kind of like jingly. Right now we're counting out and bagging up our Sebastian Silvers, which is a smaller petite oyster, into 100 count bags.
A good market oyster has a nice deep cup and a really good meat to shell ratio. So trying to have that meat close to the edge of the shell. So if you're buying a 3-inch oyster, you're not just going to have 1 or 2 inches of meat. Hopefully you'll have a full 3 inches-ish of meat. And that is all with working the oysters, chipping that growth edge.
So yeah, as you can see, the growth lips on these ones, or we also call it the feather edge. When you're through the tumbler, or like sometimes we'll shake the bag, the growth edge gets chipped, so you're creating this nice deep cup oyster versus like this one. Still has a cup on it, but it's got a backward bend and it's thinner. Because you want that nice deep cup to sit nicely on the plate to hold the liquid inside the oyster.
It is hard work and working out in Mother Nature. I mean, it's been cold, it's been hot, it's been rainy. I've always wanted to build a crew that, you know, we're tight-knit, just like a family. Being able to mesh well with the crew and each other is important.
We've started to harvest the same seed that we got when I first started working here, and that has been really, really cool for me to see. I think anyone in agriculture, aquaculture, will tell you that, to be able to raise something from essentially almost when it was born or just a few days old to being market sized and sold off. Yeah, it's a really rewarding experience.
I love my coworkers. They're great. And I just love being on the water and being able to be out here every day. Every time I come out here, it's just like an immediate mood booster. And I just love being out here, being in the sun, being with everybody, just being able to do what we do.
Of Treasure Coast Shellfish. As mentioned, we are the only farm in the Treasure Coast currently. I'm having technical difficulties. Mouse. I think everyone's been using mouse. Whoop. We'll go to this slide. I was born and raised down in Martin County. I've always loved the water, been on the water
I'm a byproduct of the Environmental Studies Center. The Environmental Studies Center is actually part of the Martin County School District. And 1 week out of the normal science curriculum from second grade up until high school, they take out a week where you learn about the spoil islands or freshwater ecosystems. And as you can see, even from when I was little, out on the boat, catching some stingrays, passed out in the back on the boogie board. I even remember field trips, my mom taking me here to Harbor Branch, and back then never would have thought I'd be up here speaking in my 30s or doing aquaculture either. Back then I was going to be the marine biologist that specializes in dolphins and paints on the side. I am still working in the water, and I like to eat, so best of both worlds. I majored in aquaculture at Florida Tech in Melbourne, Florida. My career first started out on Cape Cod. I worked for the town of Barnstable as a seasonal there, and then I've been in the industry working for universities and then on the private side in hatcheries and farms up until about 4 years ago when I decided to finally take that jump and do my own thing. Little did I know that there was going to be a pandemic. Okay. Next slide, please. Where are we located? Everyone knows where Sebastian is? Yay! All right, so circled on the map is Sebastian, also where that red star is. That is up near New Smyrna. So that is pretty much those two areas are where the only oyster farms are located on the entire East Coast. There's Treasure Coast Shellfish in Sebastian, and there's 3 other farms currently up in New Smyrna, and that is it for the entire extent of the East Coast. Next slide, please. Here's a good visual. So we're located within the Indian River Lagoon. The Indian River Lagoon encompasses 1/3 of the entire east coast of Florida. Where the red lightning bolt is, that is the Sebastian Inlet. And if you kind of look across with that river, that's the Sebastian River. Look further down where that green triangle is, that is where our nursery setup is at a private aquaculture dock. So when we do get a lot of rain, sometimes we are affected by that. Where this red star is where the farm is located. And down here is Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge. So we're in that wider part of the Indian River Lagoon, and we get the tidal flushing twice a day from the Atlantic. Next slide, please. So we were fortunate enough to apply for an older individual aquaculture lease that became available. So in our area, the AUZ, or the Aquaculture Use Zone, is north of the farm. There are 39 leases, and currently only one of them is being used and is not very active. Back in the early 90s and 2000s, they were completely filled with bottom culture and clam farmers out there. Our farm is just under 7 acres, and in that photo there, we're using about 33% of it at that time. Next slide, please. Little oyster biology real quick for you guys. So oysters are filter feeders. One adult oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water a day, and they feed on algae, which is a plant which photosynthesizes from the sun. So during those times of year when it's cloudy, there's sometimes less food in the water, and we do like that, a little bit of that freshwater influx in the water to help promote growth of good algae. And right here, I put a little diagram of a crab. So pea crabs are small crabs that can only live inside of an oyster. Raise your hand, who's seen a crab inside their oyster before? You guys are getting oysters from really healthy areas, because pea crabs can't live outside the oyster, and they're indicative of healthy growing areas. Next slide, please. As far as the life cycle, everyone got a little tidbit on that earlier. So oysters, unlike clams, they go through similar life cycle. However, in the petty villager stage, you can see right here they have, it's called a foot or a tasting foot. It's not a true foot like clams have. Essentially, they use that to hopefully find a substrate that they like to stick to, and they have a short period of time where they can actually get up and move. But for the most part, they're set after that and can't move. Next slide, please. As you can see from this photo, naturally, oysters like to sit next to each other, creating that reef. Or as you can see, these oysters that set on the drop roots of a red mangrove. And just for some perspective, this is inside of an oyster, that adductor muscle you cut, and each one of these little dots is a baby oyster. At this point, it is called spats. So in the aquaculture industry, we want seed. We want single oysters for that half-shell market. And when there's a wild spawn, or typically for restoration, you want more oysters to set to a substrate. So it creates that structure and that more reef aspect. Next slide, please. So how does that happen in a hatchery? Some hatcheries use microculture, essentially an itty-bitty piece of microscopic sand. So hopefully only one oyster larvae will set on there. So we have singles. Other hatcheries have different techniques where they don't use culch. We are fortunate enough to be working with a hatchery in Virginia. Honestly, there would have been at least a year and a half we would have not gotten seed if it wasn't for that hatchery in Virginia. Being on the east coast of Florida, there really aren't any hatcheries dedicated specifically to producing oyster seed. Why is that? I'm going to assume probably because there's only 4 farms, and it's not cost effective for a hatchery to do a spawn unless you're going to get 1 million oyster seed at once. And between the 4 farms currently, we're still growing. We cannot take that many oysters at one time. And also with Florida being on the East Coast, we are allowed to get triploid oysters, oysters that don't reproduce from the West Coast of Florida. However, they have to be tested and be 100% triploid so that they won't reproduce. And that hasn't, I think it's been about 3 years since we've been able to get seed from the West Coast of Florida. So the hatchery we've been working with in Virginia, we've sent local broodstock up to them to use those genetics to then reproduce seed, both diploid oysters. Diploids are ones that reproduce, so then they'll spawn and give back to the environment. And then also triploid oysters, they're crossing using our females. And triploidy is a naturally occurring trait. It's not genetically modified. It was selected over time. Next slide, please. So just a quick overview of the farm. Initially, when we acquired our individual lease from the state of Florida, so to acquire a lease, you lease public waterway from the state. So we pay rent to Florida Department of Agriculture every year, and you can get a bottom lease, which is using 6 inches off the bottom, or a water column lease. Getting into this time, COVID was happening, and Tallahassee wasn't having cabinet meetings. So we used a rack and bag, a bottom system that's typically used in an intertidal area where they're exposed during low tide, except I free dove. And as you can see, very quickly, different types of organisms started to recruit. Next slide. And with our dock nursery setup, we get small seed, and you saw some in the previous slide. We bump them up. Again, the dock nursery is just south of the Sebastian River in a shallower area. So typically, especially during the summer, we have better growth at this site than out on the farm. And before they're about 1 inch long, then we relay them out to the open farm. Next slide, please. And as mentioned in the video, we keep working the oysters throughout their entire life. Culling, grading, chipping to get that nice uniform shape and consistency for the half-shell market. And then also the importance of culling or grading is to weed out your slow growers from your faster growers. Just like puppies, Some grow a lot slower than others. Next slide, please. So finally, we got approval for water column, which allows us to use floating gear, and we started installing our lines in July of 21. As you can see the difference. Each cage, we can fit 4 bags into each cage, and they're closer to the surface where typically algae grows better towards the surface, the top about 3 feet in the water. Next slide, please. The cages we use have doors on both sides so we can have access to them. Each line, our main line, is 150 feet, and each line has 4 cages on them. And we also we needed to install our corner marker poles to designate the outside of the lease, and that we're using floating gear. And very quickly, does anyone know what fish that is? Triple tail, yes. Probably about, I think it was like 6 or 8 weeks, the first triple tail, and a nice one at that, started to show up, which was really cool. Next slide. So as you guys heard in the previous presentation, over in Cedar Key before starting to plant, it was desolate out there. It was essentially like a desert with a tumbleweed going by on the bottom, except the tumbleweed was maybe a catfish or a hermit crab. And very quickly, and it's been amazing, every year there's been a different species that I've found. This arrow crab is commonly found in the ornamental aquarium trade in aquaculture. The Sargent Major is a native species. We did find a sea urchin once. That was one of our rogue bags that kind of fell out. Seahorses and this manatee did pop up when we were flushing our motor one day. Last summer, I've never seen so many seahorses in my entire life. And at first I was really sad. You know, you have these beautiful seahorses, they're grasping onto the oyster cages and half-inch rope when they should be holding on to seagrass, right? Within the Indian River Lagoon. And I woke up in the middle of the night thinking about that, and then I wasn't sad anymore. I realized, because with the cages, and Susan mentioned too, amphipods, seahorses eat amphipods, and the amphipods are growing and using the structure of the cages to reproduce, which is then food for the seahorses. Next slide. We'll occasionally see some sea turtles, and then also this juvenile gray angel. I do think we get some, every once in a while, we do find some more ornamental species that come in because we are so close to the inlet. This is a nice shot of a triple tail, and then this is a juvenile triple tail that we got a photo of actually at our dock nursery. And triple tail swims sideways to mimic a fallen leaf. Like this juvenile is yellow to mimic a fallen mangrove leaf. And they're using our floating structures as habitat. Next slide. One of the cool guys that I've found. Anybody know what this is? Right. Usually you'll get them in fish tacos. Yep, that's a juvenile mahi. That threw me and everyone for a stump. It was zigging around in the nursery, and typically juvenile mahi out in the ocean use the sargassum seaweed lines as a structure to hide from predators. And this one came in, the sargassum got lost and was hanging around our floating gear in the nursery, which was amazing. And then you got mangrove snapper and sheep's head as well. Next slide. Who likes lobster? I have never in person in my life ever seen a juvenile spiny lobster before they started hardening up and getting their color. This is the first one I ever found. Its antennas broke off. I thought it was a shrimp. And upon closer look, I'm like, I think that's a spiny lobster. And as you can see here, this bag, we get a lot of biofouling. This lobster, you can see its antennae. And you can see how the coloration, When they're small, they get into the bags and they grow and they feed. And the farm is creating that structural habitat that the seagrass would provide naturally that is now lost within the lagoon. Next slide. I'm going to go back to biofouling. Our oysters to get to market are anywhere between 8 to 18 months, depending on the time of year. And Mother Nature, she's our biggest business partner, and there's no negotiating with her. Everything from spat. So farmers that use diploid oysters that reproduce, it's great. It's giving back to the environment. But we are also dealing with the spat that sets. Last summer was the war on barnacles. As you can see here on the oysters and these bags, we would see a barnacle set within less than 2 hours when we were installing brand new floating cages, and it looks like a little speck of sand. And they're ravenous. Excuse me. And then also different types of algae growing. You got your hair algae there. So that impedes the flow, the water flow of the oysters. You want water flow going through your mesh of your bags because it brings more food. More food is more flow in there, more grow for your oysters to feed on. Next slide. So oysters naturally set in that intertidal area. So they're exposed during both low tides a day. If you ever go and you see like on a boat hole or dock pilings, they're usually in that intertidal area. Florida, our tide's about, a few inches typically. So to recreate Mother Nature, we have a desiccation protocol, which essentially is, desiccation means to air dry. So we physically go in the water, flip the cages over into desiccation position. So we're mimicking Mother Nature. And why this is important is it knocks back boring sponge. If you've ever shucked an oyster or have gone out and eaten an oyster by the hinge and it just crumbles, that's boring sponge. It bores and it goes through the shell of the oyster and makes it brittle. And it knocks back predators, crabs. Blue crabs, stone crabs, mud crabs, any kind of crabs are a big predator, especially for our seed. They will go in there and just eat everything like little corn chips and have a nice little feast. That's how some of those lobsters, I think, got that big. And depending upon the year, we have a different desiccation protocol. During the winter, we don't have as much biofouling. The barnacles knock back a lot. Typically during the cooler months, we see more sea squirts. So it depends on the time of year and how long we have for our flipping protocol. Next slide. Oh, I don't even want to say it, the H word. So again, Mother Nature. 2022 was a rough season for agriculture and aquaculture as a whole. You guys remember your fruits and vegetables were harder to find and not as flavorful in the grocery stores. We didn't actually see any growth in our oyster seed until after Hurricane Ian. The river, the Indian River, was crystal clear. Crystal clear water doesn't necessarily mean healthy. In an estuary, especially like the Indian River, during the summer, it should be turbid. You should be seeing algae growing in there. And we got hit from both sides. Next slide. So what do? What we did with our nursery setup at the dock, because that gear, the floating pods and the bags aren't that robust, we took them all out. Hoped that they'd be okay, and we tied them up at the upper portion of the dock. As you can see here, Bonnie and Cody are removing the pods from the nursery, and we were actually going to do that the following day, except started to get a little wind pickup a lot quicker. And our boats, we take the boats out of the water, or our work barge. We're fortunate enough to have an island nearby where the other clam farmer and the commercial fishermen, if they can't get their boats out, put it up in a hurricane hole. Next slide. You might have seen in the video earlier behind was that one sailboat. 22 was a rough year. The sailboat broke loose. You can see right there is actually the corner marker pole for the dock lease. On the other side of that is our dock nursery, all those babies that we took out of the water. Fortunate enough, me, one of my guys, and a couple of the clam guys and the owner of the dock, we got in the water that Wednesday with Hurricane Nicole, and we pushed that sailboat off. If not, that sailboat would have kept banging up against the dock, would have went through where we would have hopefully put back our oyster seed. So we're out there during storms when it's safe, you know, protecting what we can, and especially our infrastructure. And you have, this is by the Sebastian Yacht Club boat ramp. You got everything, boards, all the grasses. There were like at least like 5-foot pieces, like docks that floated through. So that can all go through your farm. And unlike being on land where you're like, oh, we could wait a few days to put up hurricane shutters, we have about 430 cages out there right now. That's a lot to sink. And we'd flip the cages, you'd pull the caps so they sink floats down. Because if they sunk cage down, the sand could then overcover the oysters and suffocate them. We decided not to for Hurricane Ian or Nicole, and overall we were very lucky. As you can see here, you can see the damage. As earlier photos, the lines were all nice and straight. We had about 5 lines that broke. We had someone else's corner marker pole go through our lease. So what we had to do was just kind of figure it out, straighten them out. And with the cages throughout the storm, they banged up against each other. So we lost some of our oyster bags because the doors opened. And then also it's very stressful. Just to circle back around, our crop for 22, essentially there wasn't a lot of food in the water. So they starved for about 5-6 months, and then they got shaken around for a month between Hurricane Ian and Nicole. Next slide. And here's some photo of our crop loss. At the time, we did have some juvenile hard clams. Between both storms, they completely took out that crop. And over here, some of our larger seed. This, I think it was about a 3-liter subsample. That was what survived, and that what died. And then this was some of our market product that didn't make it through the storm. Next slide. So what do? You just keep moving forward and plant more oysters. You think that would also be simple. There's a need for seed. It's hard to get seed in South Florida and when you want it. There's different regulations that don't allow us to import seed if dependent upon results from pathology in different regions. Florida also currently does not allow you to collect wild spat on your lease. Hopefully that will be changing because that's how farms, especially in the Northeast and other countries, they collect wild oyster spat and then plant that. So it's really hard if you tell a farmer, hey, you want to have your crop rotation, but you don't know when you're going to get your seed, kind of makes it hard to plan for the year. And then we started to install more cages. We straightened the lines out, and we do this little raft to get them out. Next slide. And then came last summer, record-breaking land temperatures. So we had a devastating mortality event from April until July. This is what it started at. And pretty quickly it started to grow, and we were fortunate enough to have our neighbor, our homeowner nearby, ask if we wanted help with the tractor to be moving it. There are different programs. We filed for NAP and ELAP on April 21st of 23 with the USDA for crop insurance. We still have not seen any funds from that. They are shorthanded, they're short-staffed. Cedar Key got slammed as well. And there's not a lot of farms, at least where we are, for them to have appropriate adjusters to come out to evaluate the loss. Next. And I had to put one graph in here. So for June, we had a peak at one point of 90 degrees. And then salinity, as like Susan was mentioning earlier, saltwater Atlantic is 35 parts per thousand. So extended time for heat high heat and high salinity is very stressful for oysters. Next slide. And again, what do? We got more seed. We tend to it, we grow it, and get a nice, beautiful product for you guys to enjoy on your plates. Next slide. Treasure Coast Shellfish is also a certified shellfish processing facility. So what that means is we're both the farmer and the processor. So once we get it off the farm, we bring it back to our facility to pack, get it down to appropriate temperatures, and we do both retail and wholesale. And we've been working with Blue Trace tagging system, and they have this QR code on there. So you can actually scan that as well as visually look at the tag to see the harvest date, location, the time that we actually brought it into the processing facility to get down to temperature. And we can actually put little notes on there. So some restaurants ask, hey, can you put the harvest salinity on there so we can put that in our description on the menu, so we'll do that. Next slide. Are oysters safe to eat throughout the year in Florida? Yes. Yes, we are very highly regulated. I'll say the old rule of thumb with the month of R's, that was back in the icebox days. We have proper refrigeration now. This is from the Florida Department of Agriculture website. As you can see right now, we are in April. So we can still do rapid cooling. Typically, we do rapid cooling year-round. Well, and that is once the product comes into the processing cooler, it has to get to 55 or below within 2 hours. So April and October I call pre and post Vibrio months. So we can do rapid cooling. Product has to be in the cooler before 1 p.m. But then May through September, we cannot do traditional cooling. And that's all of the preventative to keep people safe and for the product to be as fresh as possible. Next slide. These are our two sizes of oysters. Our Sebastian Silvers is our Plana Petite, 2.5 to 2 3/4 inches, and our Gold doubloons are 3 inches and larger. Mother Nature has been amazing this past year. Everything's been growing like crazy. And I only went down to about Stewart. I know someone came. They said they had our oysters the other night at Sassafrats down in West Palm. But if anyone's looking to grab some lunch later, these are local restaurants that currently carry our oysters. Next slide. And just a few other photos of the oysters, different ways to prepare them. And thank you.
Okay, so right now I'm going to invite our presenters to come back up onto stage for our panel discussion. This is the time for our audience to ask questions. If you guys have any from any of the 5 presentations that we saw today, I will be walking around with a microphone. That's because we're recording this session and we want whoever is watching this in the future to be able to hear your questions. So you can either ask your question into the microphone that I have, or if you're not comfortable with that, I am more than happy to repeat it for you. We are running a little bit behind schedule, but for those of you who want to ask questions, I want to allow you guys to do that. If you aren't able to stay with us, I understand. Just to let you know, I do think that Sarah and Nicolette left some information over here on the edge of the stage. So if you want any more information on them, that's where you can find that. So I'm going to come down into the audience, and if you just want to raise your hand to let me know you have a question, I'll come find you. Okay. All right, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you. This is a question for clam and oyster folks. If they're filter feeders and they improve the environment, they're obviously filtering out bad stuff along with their food. So how does it get out of the shell and instead of on your plate?
Okay. Well, so first of all, we have anytime there's a red tide bloom or any other kind of problem out in the water, they immediately come in and shut down those areas and start to test. And they're very proactive about that. They'll shut the waters down in a heartbeat and keep them closed for an extended period to make sure that that we're not getting anything that would be harmful to you. As far as clams go, clams don't mind red tide at all. They'll eat it up. It's just so it doesn't kill our clams. It just keeps us from being able to get them to you. But there are extensive protocols in place to make sure that you don't get them.
All right, next question.
And with the red tide, I know Moat has been doing some research with red tide deprivation as far as the clams go. And then also, so like our water body where we're located, you can look this up on the state website. So each region, kind of like towns, we have different towns, but for the water bodies, like our water body area is 7202. You can look on the Florida Department of Agriculture website and see if that water body is opened or closed as well. And for our area, every area is different. If we get more than 2.54 inches of rain within 48 hours, as a precaution, they automatically close us to harvest. There might not be anything wrong, but then they go out, take a water sample that goes to a lab in Tallahassee, and they do plates and they test to see, and then hopefully we'll get the green light. Sometimes if different numbers are trending, there might not be anything wrong, but they're trending high. They might just keep us closed as a precaution, even though nothing's issue.
And she mentioned that they're also a processing facility, and why that's important is why all farmers are required to sell our product immediately to a processing facility, so that a chain of custody can be put into place where if there ever is a problem, we can track it back down to the individual farm and the individual lease where our product is grown. So, it's not just a regular farmer growing clams or oysters and then selling them to you on the side of the street. We have to take them to professionals that have a detailed health and safety protocol, and they're inspected extensively from multiple agencies. So I stake my personal and professional reputation on the fact that it is absolutely safe to eat Florida shellfish. Yes, sir.
Why should we be eating more shellfish?
Well, I'll start. First of all, clams are among the most nutrient-dense foods on planet Earth. And they've been feeding Floridians for thousands of years, clams and oysters. And beyond that, well, they're delicious. But beyond that, it's one of the few agricultural products that do not put a strain on the environment. So you can eat these products and feel good that you're not only a net negative impact on the environment, it's a net positive impact on the environment. So you can feel good about what you're doing.
They're high in protein, low in fat, and high in mineral content.
That's right. Totally sustainable. Yeah, every single part of our product gets used. The shells get used. I mean, it's there's a whole secondary industry. I've got a driveway going in with clam shells later this month, so you can really feel good that not only that you're eating something that's nutrient dense and good for the environment, but you're following in the footsteps of your forebears. The earliest Floridians only survived because of their ability to harvest and to process and to develop aquaculture.
I will mention, if you're interested in learning more about not just shellfish, but seafood in general, why you should eat it, why it's important for your health, and how to make sure that you're picking out fresh seafood at the grocery store, there was a lecture on that at the first workshop, and that's recorded online for free for you to watch whenever you'd like. All right, next question.
All right, so I have follow-on a comment with the cleaning the water that I didn't think was mentioned. So what they do clean is the nutrients, which aren't necessarily a bad pollutant, but we look at it because the volume of that becomes bad for the ecosystem. So what they're removing really isn't bad pollutants, and that's one way that helps. But my question is actually kind of for everybody, but what are ways that you think shellfish could be incorporated in restoration efforts?
Good question, Nick. like a living shoreline, oysters are great to use instead of a bulkhead or rock rubble, because they're not only are they filtering the water, but they when waves come in, they break that wave down to a natural, slower flow versus just hitting a wave comes in, you hit a bulkhead or rock rubble, and it just reverberates back off. That's damaging the dock. If there's a dock right there, that's damaging boats that's on that. And with oysters, being able to incorporate it with living shoreline plants, such as Spartina, or in the water as well, different types of seagrasses and mangroves. Because mangroves naturally, that's what builds up the shoreline is mangroves. And then with the oysters and the feces and pseudofeces, that can help fertilize those plants as well.
Yeah, so just to expand on that, so the University of Florida, on my little island of Cedar Key, they've been developing artificial concrete balls to stick out in the water. Yeah, and we were able to get some good data on how that system helped to slow down some of the incredible storm surge from Hurricane Idalia. That's an effort to try to replicate what shellfish has naturally done for eons in our state. We have a lot of coastal erosion, a lot of shoreline change in Florida because of the influence of man, the influence of development. So the more that we can help to stimulate these estuaries to look the way they did before the Industrial Revolution, it's just a natural barrier to some of the effects of the shoreline. So we're trying our best, and thank goodness the folks at UF are doing it to replicate those systems. But shellfish aquaculture, and there periodically the government will have a program to come buy a bunch of our clams or your oysters to go put them in places with delicate and fragile shorelines to try to get these natural systems in place. Anytime we can replicate the way it was before we ruined it, I think that's a good thing.
And that takes everybody to talk to your local governing body and ask for that.
I'll make a plug for next week when we'll have Hope from Brevard Zoo. Richard and I have a contract with them where we supply both oysters and clams for living shoreline restoration. So do come next month.
Next month.
A little bit more about that.
Wonderful.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. Yes, next month is going to be all about using aquaculture for restoration, stock enhancement, and aquariums. So we're really excited about Hope's talk. Okay, next question. Wow, they got them all already?
Oh, we got one right here.
Oh, sorry.
No dumb questions, right?
What? No, right. No, go ahead.
Okay. The oysters that are produced here, do they produce pearls? And if a pearl is produced, does that change the nutritional value of the oyster itself?
I don't know this answer either, so it
Pearl
can't be that dumb.
Pearl oysters are an entirely different family of oysters. It's possible that you can, get something growing, but the pearl oysters is a different family than the edible oysters. And they do occur here. We do have that family of oysters that occurs here.
Yeah, I think I always call them like a pearl oyster, but they also typically have byssal threads, and they're more closely related to a mussel actually than a true oyster. A pearl is essentially an irritant inside of an animal. Hard clams, conch, oysters, pretty much
anything that's using that mantle to lay down calcareous substance, you can get that irritant being encased.
We have found some pearls, and it's kind of ironic that 3 times we've found pearls or someone's found a pearl in our oysters was during a fundraiser event. Ironically enough.
Aw, maybe that's a new side business for you, Nicolette. All right. I'll bring that.
Question maybe for Jim. All the product that or growth from the Asian markets of all that shellfish, do you know if any of that is ending up in American markets?
Nothing,
say in our grocery stores.
Nothing fresh
Right,
gets
canned?
to us. You'll see a lot of you'll see Chinese crayfish come in. The crayfish get frozen, and you'll find those. And as often as not, that product that you're buying is a product from China. It is our red swamp crayfish. But as far as the mollusks, the perishability makes it really difficult. You will find some canned product.
I think regarding the oyster farms, you mentioned a number of leases in the area, and how many of those are actually used?